Hello, good people of the internet, and welcome to a Digidope video. Actually, this is a review. I'm your host, Carl, and today we're going to be looking at the latest entrant in the GPU space. That's right, we have an Intel Arc A770 GPU here. We're going to be putting it through its paces, or rather, it put me through its paces, but a bit more on that later. We now have 3 GPU makes to choose from. It's almost like the days of the early 2000s, back when there were more GPU makers than fingers on your hand. Yes, the likes of 3DFX, NVIDIA, PowerVR, Matrox, Rendition, and of course ATI. However, the war for supremacy saw many casualties along the way, eventually leaving only 2 standing, NVIDIA and AMD. This stalemate siege has seen the value segment slowly erode and was further exacerbated by the pandemic, where we saw 5-year-old entry-level GPUs rise to crazy high prices, well above their original MSRP. And for any enthusiast out there, I'm sure I don't have to mention this. If you tried to find a card during the pandemic, it was brutal. However, a new battle in the mid-range entry-level market is set to erupt, and Intel has thrown their hat in the ring, officially kicking off the RGB wars. There was great fanfare before the arrival of the Arc A770, with promises of a new standard in price to performance. But as far as first strikes go, there was not a lot of shock and awe. Now don't get me wrong, we're very happy to see the new contender, but this war machine still needs some work. We have a 14-game benchmark suite, and we'll dive into that and have a look at the numbers. If you're really more interested in the 14-game average and our final recommendations, I'll put timestamps in the description below, and if I can figure out YouTube chapters, you'll have an easy way to skip ahead. If you do, though, please remember to like and subscribe. To the charts. First up, Assassin's Creed Valhalla. At 1080p, we see the A770 is 44% slower than the RX 6600 XT and 19% slower than the RTX 3060. At 1440, we see the margins shrink significantly, and the A770 is only 19% slower than the 6600 and 7% behind the RTX 3060. At 4K, we see a shift, and now the A770 is 7% faster than the 6600 and 4% faster than the 3060. However, at this level, we're only talking about a couple of frames. What is impressive to note, though, is that the A770's solid showing in 1% lows. Next up, we have Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. No, it's not 2009. Here at 1080p, we see the IW engine really favors AMD GPUs, and the A770 is a massive 50% slower than the 6600 XT, while falling only 12% behind the RTX 3060. At 1440p, we see the A770 is 35% slower than the 6600, but has gained ground against NVIDIA, and tied the RTX 3060 at 72 FPS. At 4K, the A770 is still 19% slower than the 6600, but has now surpassed the 3060 by a 6% margin. Really interesting stuff here. As we move on, we're going to look at Cyberpunk 2077. The A770 is 54% slower at 1080p than the RX 6600 XT and 36% slower than the RTX 3060. At 1440p, we see those margins shrink. Now the A770 is only 11% behind the 6600 XT and 6% behind the 3060. The A770 only fell by an average of 10 PS. So while the other GPUs were hit much harder at this resolution. At 4K, we see another role reversal, and the A770 is over 20% faster than both the 6600 and 3060, although none of these GPUs produced a desirable frame rate at 4K. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider, another familiar pattern. However, I'd like to mention the lack of 1% low data was an oversight in the data recording, which we didn't notice until we were ready to record this video. Having said that, at 1080p, the A770 is 56% behind the 6600 XT and 39% behind the 3060. At 1440p, we see the A770 is 30% behind the RX 6600 XT and 24% behind the 3060. However, the noteworthy stat here is that on average, the A770 only lost 6 FPS between 1080p and 1440p. Really impressive stuff. At 4K, the A770 edged out both the 6600 XT and 3060 by 3%. However, at these frame rates, it's functionally a three-way tie. Watchdogs Legion is up, and it has some interesting numbers. At 1080p, the A770 is 11% slower than the RX 6600 XT, but 3% faster than the 3060. At 1440p, we see this made up even more ground, now only 5% slower than the 6600 XT, and has increased its lead over the 3060 to 12%. At 4K, the A770 now leads both competitors by 20% and producing a playable 4K result. Its 1% lows almost match the average frame rate of both the other cards. Very impressive stuff. Control is next, and it seems Control is what NVIDIA has lost in this sponsored title, as the A770 walks all over the competition. At 1080p, the ARC card is 33% faster than the RX 6600 XT and 27% faster than the RTX 3060. At 1440p, the A770 stretches its lead to 116% faster than the RX 6600 XT and 43% faster than the 3060. At 4K, the RX 6600 XT and RTX 3060 do not produce playable frame rates and fall considerably behind the A770. However, it is not quite capable of producing a good gaming experience at 2160p either. Moving on through our suite, Metro Exodus is another strong showing for the Intel Arc A770. At 1080p, it leads the RX 6600 XT by 34% and the RTX 3060 by 45%. At 1440p, the news gets worse for the competition, as ARC now leads the AMD and NVIDIA cards by 49% and 58% respectively. The RTX 3060 average frame rate is only able to match the 1% lows of the A770. At 4K, the A770 maintains a playable average while maintaining a 46% lead over the RX 6600 XT and 52% over the RTX 3060, neither of which are offering a good gaming experience at this resolution. Rainbow Six Extraction is another strong showing for the A770. Looking at the 1080p, it leads the RX 6600 XT by 7%, and the RTX 3060 by 3%. At 1440p, it again widens the margin by 22% over the RX 6600 XT and 8% over the RTX 3060. At 4K, it is 40% faster than the 6600 XT and 13% faster than the RTX 3060, an excellent result for the new competitor. However, now we take our first look at a non-DX12 or Vulkan game. Rainbow Six Siege runs on the older DirectX 11 API, which means the ARC A770 is using a translation layer to convert the API calls. This overhead does not do performance any favors. At 1080p, the A770 is a massive 428% slower than the RX 6600 XT and 363% slower than the RTX 3060. While 82 FPS is a playable frame rate, it is far from ideal on this competitive shooter. At 1440p, the A770 impressively only drops 7 FPS and is now losing by 255% and 293% to the 6600 XT and RTX 3060 respectively. At 4K, the A770 is 100% slower than the AMD card and 123% slower than the NVIDIA. However, it's worth noting the A770 has only lost 20 FPS from 1080p all the way up to 4K, while the other cards lost hundreds of frames. When Intel does finally optimize for this DirectX 11 title, it will be interesting to revisit and see how things may change. Now more trouble for ARC as we look at CSGO, a DirectX 9 title. However, things are not as bad as we expected. While Intel recently announced a new driver that would greatly improve A770 performance in CSGO, the driver known as 3959, our benchmarks did not use it as we were already completed long before the announcement. So please note our benchmarks were done with driver 3802. And this driver was used to resolve some issues we were having that was preventing us from benchmarking the A770 in our test system. So while the driver 3959 has impressive gains, it's only about 10% better than the results in this chart. If you hear people talk about hundreds of more frames with this new driver, they were using a previous version to the driver we benchmarked with, likely the October 11th original release driver, 3490, or the 3793 driver, which was released for Call of Duty. Now, let's have a look at 1080p. We can see the A770 is 55% slower than the RX 6600 XT and 36% slower than the RTX 3060. At 1440p, we see the A770 maintains its 55% disadvantage to the RX 6600 XT, while it does slightly better, now being only 30% slower than the 3060. At 4K, the results remain surprisingly similar. 55% behind the RX 6600 XT and 32% behind the RTX 3060. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds is up next and provides interesting results. At 1080p, the A770 is 18% behind the 6600 XT and 16% behind the RTX 3060. However, its 1% lows are better than both the AMD and NVIDIA GPUs. Moving up to 1440p, we see the margins shrink to 1%. Each card is only 1% difference from its neighbor. And at 4K, we see a real change in the A770. It only loses 9 FPS on average and is nearly double the frame rate of its two counterparts. To say I was suspicious of these results would be an understatement. And benchmarking Battle Royale games without a built-in tool is challenging. However, PUBG is one of my favorite games, which I've accumulated thousands of hours on since 2017. So I spent many hours redoing benchmarks, not just with the A770, but with the RX 6600 XT and RTX 3060. The results were repeatable and consistent. I'm not sure what secret sauce Intel has going on in this game at 4K, or if it was a function of the larger VRAM buffer. Although if that was the case, we would have expected to see the 3060 benefit from that over the 6600 XT. I assume there's a feature being turned off when using the ARC GPU that's benefiting these numbers, but line by line, the comparisons of the graphics settings didn't reveal it to me. What's more confusing is while it seems in the first minutes of the match the ARC card is a stuttery mess, but then that clears up fairly early on and is fine for the entire match. And still more confusing is I can't see any obvious differences in the quality between the cards when looking at the individual images. All the detail looks to be as closely between them as possible. Fortnite was a real problem to benchmark with the A770, more difficult than even the 3060 was in Modern Warfare 2, and that is saying something. We'll discuss it later in the user experience section, but basically we required 3 separate systems to attempt to test this card successfully with Fortnite, and still we were only able to get it work with DX11, while both the AMD and NVIDIA cards had been benchmarks with DirectX 12. So let's look at the numbers. At 1080p, the A770 is 19% behind the RX 6600 XT and 20% behind the RTX 3060. At 1440p, the A770 is now 23% behind the RX 6600 XT and 8% behind the RTX 3060. At 4K, the A770 is only 4% behind the RX 6600 XT and manages to be 20% ahead of the RTX 3060. Now, once the DirectX 12 issues are resolved, it'll be really interesting to revisit these benchmarks and see what the ARC card can do when it doesn't have to use a translation layer for the API calls. Next up, we have Far Cry 6 and a return to form for the Intel GPU. Although there are some oddities during gameplay that we'll discuss later in the user experience. At 1080p, the A770 is only 2% slower than the RX 6600 XT and 5% faster than the RTX 3060. At 1440p, the A770 is 1% slower than the 6600, or functionally tied, and is 15% faster than the RTX 3060. At 4K, the A770 shines, producing a playable experience while being 13% faster than AMD and 21% faster than NVIDIA. And looking at the last game in our benchmark, Red Dead Redemption 2, there are some proclivities with benchmarking this game, but none are specific to the A770. Both NVIDIA and AMD had issues here as well. But once we got everything working properly, at 1080p we saw the A770 trailed the RTX 6600 XT by 28% and the RTX 3060 by 10%. At 1440p, those margins shrank to 20% and 9% respectively. And at 4K, we see the GPUs are performing very similarly, with an A770 only a few frames behind the 6600 XT and RTX 3060. Not a bad result. So let's have a look at the 14 game average. At first glance, the A770 looks to lag behind significantly at 1080p, as much as 40%. However, this is due to the inclusion of the older titles like CSGO and Rainbow Six Siege, requiring the A770 to use the API translation layer. If you don't play many older titles, then the A770 does look far more competitive. At 1440p, it tightens up the race, even with the older games still in the mix. And at 4K, the A770 matches the competition. And while the average appears to be 60 FPS, none of these cards were designed to run high settings at native 4K, and you generally won't have a great experience. Where are the ray tracing and upscaling results? This is going to have to follow in another video. Some of the challenges we encountered while benchmarking dragged the production out for weeks. The production of this video had intended to be released on November 7th. I finished writing this on December 17th. So, as that is our segue, let's get into user experience. Physically installing the ARC A770 is no more difficult than any other card. It requires an 8-pin and 6-pin power connector and a 16 times PCI Express slot. Once installed, you'll want to enter your BIOS and confirm you have resizable bar enabled or smart access memory, depending on the nomenclature in your motherboard. However, having a monitor turn on during boot is not a guarantee. And during our initial testing, we didn't have those issues, but later on that changed. Now, as most people do, you start Googling for your drivers. And Googling Intel ARC drivers takes you to the main landing page for the driver download, and it's fairly straightforward. If you already have the Intel Driver Support Assistant installed, if you have other Intel hardware, it's as easy as clicking the icon and checking for new drivers. Select Download, and then select Install. Once you have the driver installed, a reboot's recommended. Then the first trial of ARC begins. The ARC Control Center. The ARC Control Center basically takes over your PC right after boot and prevents desktop interaction until it has finished loading. It also obscures your notification area, and it covers up legitimate Windows notifications are unable to interact with or view until ARC's completed loading and decided that you have suffered long enough. It then presents you with a click here for the latest driver message. And if you do click and follow the link, in some cases, it takes you to a beta driver page that looks exactly like the release page. I can see this causing a lot of confusion and just general issues for the uninitiated. I ended up using Task Manager to disable ARC controls so that I didn't have to endure it on every boot up. At first, my experiences with ARC in gaming was good. I started playing the games I usually do recreationally, which meant PUBG and Star Citizen. PUBG, the start of matches were really stuttery, and it persisted through the whole game. However, the A770 came with a free version of Modern Warfare 2. And this free version of Modern Warfare 2 also came with a new driver release for the ARC card. When we upgraded the ARC driver from 3490 to 3793, the stuttering went away in PUBG. Not immediately, during the initial loading screen and parachuting down to the map, and the first few, say 30 seconds to a minute in the game, you would still get these strange, like just sudden drops and stutters. But after about the 1 minute mark, that was completely clear. So as long as you weren't hot dropping, it definitely wasn't a problem. If you were, you had to play a little more cautiously. Later, when I was benchmarking Fortnite, the ARC card would just black screen over and over at different times, but always before we were able to launch a game. I tried to move on to the next games in our test suite, but as soon as a game started the 3D engine, I would get the nefarious black screen. I confirmed no updates had been installed. Windows updates had been disabled for testing. I confirmed that we were still running on the same ARC driver, and none of Intel's tools had installed an update unbeknownst to us. It doesn't look like that is a feature that either the Intel Support Assistant or the ARC Control Center supports. I was able to continue testing the RX 6600 XT and RTX 3060 with the rest of the benchmark suite, and they worked mostly flawlessly. The 3060 in Modern Warfare is a different story. I installed the ARC card again, and to my surprise, it worked in a few games, so I went to benchmarking. It promptly quit as soon as I tried Fortnite. I opened an issue with Intel, and I collected system scan data, driver information, went through a bunch of troubleshooting steps and submitted that to Intel, and I'm still waiting on the results. That was submitted on November 26th, and it is now December 21st, and I don't have an answer from them. So we took the ARC card and installed it in an Intel 11700K test bench, and it worked fine. We tested it with 3060, the 6600 XT, and the A770 in this 11700K to confirm our card was performing as it should. Everything seemed to be fine. We brought the ARC card back, and with BIOS updates, driver updates, fresh Windows installs of Windows 10 and games, still did not work. Fresh Windows 11 install and fresh game installed, still did not work. So we were getting quite frustrated with the ARC at this point, and I decided to replace the board in our benchmarking system. The mid-range test system was an MSI B450 with 5600X CPU. So we replaced that with an Asus Prime X570 Pro board. We confirmed it was on the latest BIOS and that rebar was enabled. I ran some control runs on the RX 6600 XT and RTX 3060 to ensure the gaming performance was unchanged. I then installed the ARC card, and it magically worked. It worked absolutely everywhere, except Fortnite. I was no longer getting the black screen crashes, but I was unable to play a match. After much troubleshooting and another fresh install of both the OS and the game, I tried it, and it worked. What was the difference? By default, on the fresh install, no manual settings are configured, and DirectX 11 was selected. When I selected DirectX 12, Fortnite would crash. So for whatever reason, the current version of Fortnite and the ARC A770 drivers did not work together. This was a repeatable issue, and we were only able to test it with DirectX 11. This, of course, was added to our Intel support case that we're still waiting on information from. This was an over week-long evening troubleshooting bonanza. And when I mentioned at the start, this reminded me of the 90s and early 2000s. It was never more true than during that troubleshooting. People may not remember, but PC gaming was challenging. Driver conflicts, hardware incompatibilities, software incompatibilities. The original 3D accelerators like 3DFX Voodoo, NVIDIA GeForce, ATI Radeon, they all had issues, and almost every other game. That's what kept PC gaming out of the mainstream and launched the console revolution. We are now living in a golden age of PC gaming where games are expected to just work on the hardware you have. Arc is a return to that era of unfleshed out drivers and incompatibilities. And in some ways, it's glorious. It shows us how far we've come, and that a multi-billion-dollar company can't just replicate more than 20 years of experience overnight. However, it was not alone when it came to issues. The RTX 3060 had issues with Modern Warfare 2 that took days to solve, and that was all NVIDIA. Whenever I tried to launch a game or benchmarks, I got one of several different dev code errors and could go no further. Now eventually, days later, with NVIDIA driver 52737, I was able to leave the incessant dev errors in COD behind and successfully capture a series of benchmark runs. However, I do have to touch on a few other shortcomings of the ARC control panel besides its startup behavior, which is awful. The built-in telemetry screen, which is Alt-O, has all kinds of information, but has no frame rate counter. I would argue that that is the most desired metric of the average gamer, and to overlook it is just boggling. ARC control does not seem to have a hotkey for screenshots either, like Alt F1 in NVIDIA. It's very strange. These are some of the most basic features expected from modern graphics cards, and somehow they're missing in favor of obscuring notifications and breaking your desktop control. Another feature ARC is sorely lacking is noise and sound suppression. I ended up personally with a 30 series card because I needed NVIDIA Broadcast. It was RTX voice back then. But it was so good at cleaning up background noise. And my chair squeaks. I have loud furnace and or air conditioner in the summer. It could get very loud in my office. And it makes streaming or recording video, communicating with teammates in games, or especially Zoom meetings for work, very difficult. And AMD and NVIDIA both have solutions that work really well. Now, admittedly, the AMD one is very new, but it works quite well. Now, when I recorded my last video in our ARC series, the A770 was in my editing machine, and so I had to use a third-party tool for the sound suppression. The tool was called Crisp. You may or may not know it, and it worked reasonably well, but it has a cost of $8 a month. Intel could certainly use a solution here, but it's less pressing than its other driver optimizations. And finally, the largest problem with ARC is the cost. Intel tried to come in aggressively, but they were at least a year too late. $4.99 Canadian at newegg.ca for an A770, or $4.49 at Canada Computers. That's as much or more than an RTX 3060. Definitely more than a 6600 XT or 6650 XT. Now, further exacerbating the issue, of course, is the used market. It's just flooded with cards right now. I picked up this 6600 XT for 350 Canadian dollars 2 months ago now, and they're even cheaper. In fact, I've seen 6700 XTs for that price. So, should you buy an ARC? That depends. Is building a PC and troubleshooting a hobby for you? Do you enjoy that aspect? Do you want an affordable way to try AV1 encoding that doesn't require a mortgage? Looking at you here, NVIDIA. Are you looking for the best mid-range FPS per dollar? Then Arc is not for you. Do you just want to play games trouble-free? Arc's not for you. However, if PC troubleshooting is a hobby, you enjoy testing things out and troubleshooting problems, Arc isn't a bad way to go. For the most part, it did work in most games that I played. You just never know when one of these issues is going to crop up because it's such a new product. And again, like with the NVIDIA card, they can crop up in brand new games. So should you buy the Arc? Really, it's personal preference. But it does have an interesting video encoder. It looks fantastic in games. It's just not quite a finished product, and the drivers could still be years away from being comparable to NVIDIA or even AMD. And yes, I said AMD. Arc has excelled at one thing for sure, is that it makes AMD look good. During this marathon of benchmarking and troubleshooting, the 6600 XT was the only thing that worked every time and in every game. Now, having said all of that, this A770 is going back into my daily driver and can continue long-term testing for review. We'll be following up with upscaling and ray tracing, and those are a different suite of games. They all need to support DLSS, FSR, and XeSS to get a true idea of where we sit. Now, I think the Arc is worth trying. It's not perfect, and you really have to want to give it a go. But if you do, it is a perfectly fine card. So, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumb up, like, and subscribe. And if you'd like to see more of these videos, we have links here you should see to our original unboxing, and if you did buy an Arc, how to get your free copy of Modern Warfare 2. If you have any questions about anything in the video, or you want anything explained further, please leave a comment down below. Thanks for watching, and until next time, this is Carl signing off for Digito. Bye!